This man possesses a massive imposing build, yet for most of his life he was believed to have zero talent for combat and absolutely no aptitude for magic. He was scouted solely to serve as a humble gatekeeper, a position he held faithfully for 15 years before being unceremoniously fired. It was only after this dismissal that he discovered a staggering truth. Every power he imagines he can manifest into reality. His strength is nothing short of godlike. He can effortlessly annihilate a battalion of high-ranking orcs, creatures capable of wiping an entire city off the map, and he can clear the clouds from the sky with a single casual shot. He defeats monsters simply by walking past them and bests veteran adventurers while standing still, doing nothing at all. For him, the struggle is no longer about becoming stronger. His true challenge lies in the desperate search for a way to control his overwhelming power. There is much more to this man's journey, but to avoid spoiling the surprises ahead, let us begin the story. Deep within the confines of a demon castle, Royal and his comrades stood their ground, weapons drawn against the high-ranking demon Lilius. Note: Lilius acknowledged Royal's exceptional prowess and extended an invitation for him to become her servant, promising him specialized privileges in exchange for his loyalty. Royal gritted his teeth, his gaze drifting toward the demon's alluring, ample curves. Cynthia, the maiden of holy punishment, sharply interjected, commanding him to focus on the task at hand. Once again, Royal's eyes wandered back to the same distracting sight. Rinka, a warrior following the path of Asura, warned him that wandering eyes were strictly unacceptable. Royal shifted his gaze once more, though this time his eyes landed on Rinka's flat chest. This prompted her to erupt in a tantrum, despite Royal not uttering a single word. Sara, the fire spirit, addressed him as master, and cautioned that if he dared to betray their bond, she would roast him alive. Understanding the gravity of his situation, Royal declared to his party that they were all the most important people to him. Turning back to Lilius, he asserted that it was time to conclude their conflict. When Lilius beckoned them to strike, the party charged her simultaneously. Suddenly, Royal jolted awake, returning to reality. It had all been a dream, a product of his vivid imagination. Noticing the sun beginning to set, he realized it was nearly time to conclude his shift. He was no legendary hero, he was merely a gatekeeper. He indulged frequently in daydreaming, a habit that allowed him to endure a job that required nothing more than standing still all day. He had been scouted by the knights 15 years ago, likely due to his massive, imposing build. He recalled the day he was walking down the street, carrying a basket like a backpack, when a group of knights noticed his physique. They approached him, asking if he wished to join their ranks in the town of Sakuran. An old man, also carrying a basket on his back, placed a hand on Royal's shoulder and remarked that his future was now secure. At 15 years old, Royal stood 190 centimeters tall and felt thrilled by the potential of his own body. However, the knights eventually began to gossip, noting that while he possessed an incredible build, he was all show. He proved to be terrible with both the sword and the spear, possessing no martial talent whatsoever. During a meeting in the office, the knight commander inquired about his progress, noting that Royal appeared to be training diligently. Royal replied non-committally. The commander observed that everyone possesses different talents, suggesting that Royal might find success in their small elite mage corps. Royal reflected silently on the common belief that magic and martial arts were a trade-off. Since he lacked martial skill, he hoped he might possess magical aptitude. However, he found he could not summon even a spark of magic. Returning to the office, the commander instructed him to simply stand at his post. He was assigned as the guard of the North Gate, a quiet location where few people passed and monsters never appeared. His instructions were to remain stationary and silent, speaking only to relay messages in emergencies. For 15 years he stood at that gate, lost in his thoughts. He often imagined that if he could use magic, he would defeat enemies in a single blow to rescue a lady in distress. His reverie was broken when a bald man asked why he was spacing out. The man delivered a message, stating that Royal was required in the commander's office. Upon his arrival, the commander informed him that he was fired and should not return the following day. The unit had decided to implement automated surveillance and interception magic tools to replace him. Royal left the knight headquarters and walked through the streets, reflecting on his journey from being a scouted recruit to being labeled useless. Instead of succumbing to anger, he punched the air in a fit of joy, shouting in a voice he hadn't used for 15 years. He felt liberated from a life of inertia. He decided that after a decade and a half, he would finally become an adventurer. He wanted to be the protagonist of the stories he had always imagined. A week passed, yet no grand adventures had manifested. Aside from helping an old lady carry her belongings, his days remained quiet. Nevertheless, he took comfort in the changing scenery, noting that it was far better than standing still at a gate. He anticipated that his true journey would begin once he reached the adventurer's town of Melki. Along the way, he spotted a young girl huffing for air, struggling with an injured leg. Royal smiled, thinking that a heroine had finally appeared. He believed a true protagonist could not ignore someone in distress and imagined a gallant approach where he would extend a helping hand. However, when the girl turned and saw him, she was struck with terror. He asked if she was all right, but to her, his voice sounded menacing. Royal froze, realizing that he had barely spoken for 15 years and lacked any social grace. He tried to calm himself, reminding himself that his intentions were pure and that he was not suspicious. He attempted to speak again to clear the air, but he could barely form a coherent word. The girl's fear only intensified. Realizing the situation was failing and that his massive physique was only making things worse, he suddenly fell to the ground, berating himself internally for the blunder. The girl, seeing his clumsy fall, burst out laughing. She approached him, apologized for her reaction and extended her hand to help him up. As she assisted the massive Royal, she winced, mentioning she had twisted her leg earlier. Royal felt like a fool. She was injured so severely she could barely walk, yet she had tried to help someone of his size. He realized she wasn't a character in a fantasy, she was simply a kind person. He recalled one of his daydreams where he saved a girl and healed a twisted leg with magic. Lost in the memory, he unconsciously pointed his hand at the girl's injury and recited the spell from his imagination. When he opened his eyes, he panicked, wondering what he was doing. To the girl's absolute shock, her leg was instantly healed. She tested her movement and jumped in excitement, exclaiming that the pain was gone and the injury was cured. She thanked him profusely, calling the feat incredible. Royal remained speechless, remembering how everyone had called him useless at magic years prior. The girl remarked that she had never seen magic like his before, and asked if he was a high-level mage. Stunned and confused, Royal simply pointed a finger at himself, silently asking if she was truly talking about him. Magic is defined by disparity. To command a portion of the world and bend it to one's will is a gift reserved for a select few with innate talent, specifically a mere 10% of the population. Within that small group, only another 10% ever truly ascend the hierarchy, forming a steep pyramid of inequality where even the gifted must undergo arduous training. For instance, priests who reach the end of their conditioning may acquire the sacred magic of healing, yet most can only manage a partial alleviation of pain. True, complete recovery is an achievement beyond their reach, reserved exclusively for those at the very pinnacle of that pyramid. Still awestruck by her recovery, the girl asked for his name. Royal introduced himself, and she remarked with gratitude that he had saved her. She shared that her name was Diz and offered a warm greeting. Royal looked down at his hand, his mind racing with the silent realization that the spell he had just cast was not a real incantation. It did not exist in any magical tome. He wondered how he, a man with no magical aptitude, could recite those words with such certainty. The answer was simple. He had invented them. It was merely a piece of lore, a setting he had crafted during 15 years of idle fantasies. Diz suggested that he use his power to heal the scratches he received when he tripped earlier. Royal silently directed the imagined spell toward his own face, and a soft, glowing light materialized. As his skin mended, he realized his new reality was true. During his initial test for the Knight's Order, he had failed to manifest even a spark of power. He had not been part of that talented minority. Diz then inquired if he was also traveling toward the city of Melki, assuming as much since they were on the same road. She proposed that they journey together. Royal hesitated, asking if she wasn't wary of him. He scratched the back of his head, gesturing to his massive frame, and admitting that he was quite poor at conversation. Diz chuckled, assuring him that she wasn't bothered at all, noting that she considered herself a good judge of character. Royal remained speechless, still uncertain of why his imagination had gained form, but he felt a quiet sense of joy that he could be of use to her. As they walked, Diz revealed that she had been expelled from her position as a saintess. She had trained in the holy city for years, but could never master sacred magic. Eventually, the authorities cast her out. In a fit of rage, she had torn her vestments right in front of her superior's face and stormed out. It was during her frustrated escape that she had tripped and injured herself. Royal searched his mind for the right words to comfort her, thinking of something encouraging like, "Good things are bound to happen." However, before he could speak, Diz punched the air with determination. She declared her intent to become an adventurer in Melki, asserting that such a life suited her far better, and she only regretted taking so long to realize it. Royal marveled at her inner strength. Diz was about to ask him another question when a distant scream pierced the air. She asked if he could use detection magic to locate the source. Royal recalled the specific settings he had created for such a feat in his fantasies. Closing his eyes to focus, he perceived the voice of a woman in armor cursing, as she lamented that her targets had escaped. She dropped to her knees in despair, as a man behind her urged her to remain calm. She countered sharply, asking how she could possibly stay composed, when as a knight charged with protection, she had allowed the princess to be captured by bandits. The man explained that their enemies were members of the Assassin's Guild she despised, experts in stealth and former subordinates of his who had turned traitor. He vowed to clean up the mess and demonstrate the true power of the ruler of the Assassin's Guild. Royal then cast Mundus Kuvra, the invisible hand that covers the world. To his shock, the imagined spell functioned perfectly. He informed Diz that 500 meters ahead, 3 high orcs were attacking a human. Diz rushed toward the location immediately, shouting that she understood. As she dashed away, Royal stared at his hand and silently confirmed that he truly could wield magic. He clenched his fist, fueled by a new resolve, and realized that if his healing and detection settings worked, he could surely employ offensive magic as well. In another time, or perhaps another reality, an ancient dragon descended upon a city. It was a calamity incarnate, a monster capable of eradicating an entire nation single-handedly. A knight clutched his head in despair, lamenting that their country was finished. However, a man floating serenely in the sky questioned that assumption. The knight addressed him as Lord Royal. Royal merely muddled over the thought, wondering if a power capable of destroying a nation was truly greater than the strength he now held. In the present, Royal cast Omnis, the spell designed to pierce all things, and casually flicked his finger. 3 devastating magic bullets streaked past Diz and struck the 3 high orcs before a guard could even swing a sword. Those who witnessed the event stood in awe as the massive creatures were incinerated instantly, leaving nothing but ashes behind. Diz wondered if the attack had originated from Royal as he approached the carriage, asking if everyone was unharmed. Diz confirmed that no one was hurt, and pointed toward the scorched earth, inquiring if that incredible display was his doing. Royal simply confirmed it. Diz jumped in amazement, questioning if he had used some form of homing, auto-tracking projectiles. She remarked that he was insanely strong. Royal reflected silently on the gravity of the situation. His idle fantasies, the healing, the detection, and the high-level offensive magic had manifested in reality. He possessed the strongest class of spells despite having no formal talent. He tilted his head down, wondering why this was happening. As Diz mimicked his posture, the travelers from the carriage bowed deeply, thanking him for saving their lives, and asking how they could ever repay such a debt. A young woman stepped out of the carriage to offer her gratitude personally. She introduced herself as Flora Din, daughter of Count Din, the governor of the region. She bowed respectfully, thanking Royal for his intervention. Royal remained speechless, realizing this was a pivotal moment where the story could only progress if he spoke. A flash of insight struck him. If he could use the magic from his imagination, surely he could use the maxed-out communication skills of his imagined self as well. He believed all he needed to do was realize he was capable, to respond like a calm, gracious gentleman. He attempted to introduce himself courteously, but the words failed him. His face contorted into a terrifying expression, making the atmosphere incredibly awkward. Misinterpreting his silence and intimidating presence, the guards grew cautious, drawing their swords to protect Flora. They questioned if Royal was actually an associate of the High Orcs, who intended to finish what they started. Diz immediately intervened, shouting for them to stop with perfect native-level pronunciation. She knelt with her hand over her heart, apologizing for the misunderstanding. She asserted that while Royal struggled to speak properly due to nerves, it was undeniably his magic that had saved them. She pleaded for their forgiveness, expressing her genuine relief that Lady Flora and the others were safe. Flora, realizing her mistake, apologized for her rudeness and asked Diz to rise. As a noble, she insisted on repaying their kindness and invited both of them to her family's estate in Melki. They joined the group inside the carriage, where Royal sat in silent contemplation. He realized that while his magic was legendary, his communication skills remained hopeless. As he watched the two girls interact, he noted that Flora and Diz were both 16 and were already bonding over the prospect of trying desserts at the estate. He marveled at Diz. Despite his social failures, she spoke to him normally, diffused his blunders, and befriended a noble's daughter as if they were old friends. To Royal, she was the ancient dragon of communication skills. Upon arriving at the Din estate, Flora welcomed them inside. While Royal was still mentally rehearsing how to speak properly, Diz asked if he was a solo party. Royal was confused by the term, so she clarified, asking if he was adventuring alone, as he seemed quite experienced. Royal managed to reply that he was actually just starting out as an adventurer in this town. Diz was surprised, noting that his attire and overwhelming magic made him seem like a veteran. Realizing they were both beginners, she pondered for a moment before asking him to form a party with her. Inside the estate, before they commenced their meal, the Count insisted that his guests eat their fill, offering them as much as they desired. He declared them the saviors of his daughter's life, and by extension the saviors of his own heart as well. During the feast, Royal reflected on the moment Diz had invited him to form a party. She had proposed they work together to take on commissions, seek out adventures, and earn a living. Because Royal had remained silent, she had simply told him to take his time and think it over. In the present, the Count inquired if gold coins were truly a sufficient reward, offering further assistance if they required it. Diz politely declined, asserting that the gold was more than enough. When the Count asked about her future plans, she explained that she intended to use Melki as her base for adventuring. The Count remarked that it was a wonderful ambition, and noted that if they ever found themselves in trouble, they should not hesitate to seek him out. Diz replied that his generous words were most humbling, and expressed her desire to contribute to the town in whatever small way she could. She then leaned in and whispered to Royal that the formalities were finally over, mentioning they were invited to stay the night. When Royal finally entered his room and lay down, his mind turned back to the prospect of a partnership. Even though they had only just met, he felt a profound respect for Diz. Being sought out by someone as capable as her was more than he could have ever hoped for. Yet a shadow of doubt lingered. He wondered if someone as amazing as she was could truly be satisfied with a companion like him. He cursed his own insecurity, telling himself that since Diz had extended the invitation, he should respond with confidence. The following morning, Diz greeted him warmly. Royal struggled to find his voice, forcing out stuttering words until he finally managed to ask her to form a party with him. Diz agreed immediately before greeting Flora. Flora returned the greeting, and Diz remarked on how wonderfully she had slept, praising the fluffiness of the estate's beds. As Royal watched them interact, he began to feel the heavy weight of his new responsibility. Outside the mansion, Diz informed the Count and his daughter that it was time for them to depart. Flora thanked them once more, and invited Royal to visit again someday. Diz echoed the sentiment, thanking them for their hospitality. As they walked away from the mansion, Royal reflected on his situation. He had reached a new town and somehow gained a companion. For 15 years from his late teens through his 20s, his life had been stagnant stagnant, but now it was finally moving forward. When Diz asked what their next move should be, Royal felt a tear of joy well up. To him the choice was obvious, the guild. He believed they needed to register as adventurers before diving into dungeons. However, Diz suggested they visit a real estate agency first to secure a base of operations. Royal questioned the necessity of a base, but Diz explained that while the guild was important, she had dealt with far too many issues at inns during her travels. Since they planned to stay in Melky for a while, she wanted a place of their own, noting it was more cost-effective than an inn. Royal understood, silently speculating that a girl with Diz's looks had likely been harassed by unpleasant men in the past. Diz then proposed they decide on a signal for negotiations. They eventually arrived at a real estate agency. Inside, a man sat drinking coffee and reading a magazine, priding himself on 20 years of thriving in the business. His motto was providing good properties to good customers, or so he claimed. When Royal and Diz entered, Diz pointed to a sign out front regarding a cursed property and asked for details. The realtor, a man named Zanbi, welcomed them warmly and offered tea while he gathered the documents. Internally, he gloated, viewing them as the perfect marks. He saw Royal as an airheaded, dull-looking man, and Diz as a naive girl with unfounded confidence. To him, the haunted property sign was mere bait to lure in suckers. Zanbi showed them the paperwork, explaining that the property was haunted by a high-ranking wraith. He claimed that while it normally rented for 300,000 yen per month, he would offer it to them for 150,000 yen if they were willing to perform the exorcism. Privately, he mocked them, thinking the dump wasn't worth 100,000 yen. Following the pre-arranged signal, Diz touched her ear. She questioned if the price was truly 150,000 yen. Zanbi began to insist it was a bargain for a mansion of that size, but he stopped mid-sentence when he looked up at the towering Royal. Royal, acting on the signal, asked, "What?" with a terrifying, menacing intensity. Zanbi was paralyzed with fear. In his 20 years of sizing up customers, he felt certain that the man before him was prepared to kill him. At that moment, Zanbi saw his own death staring him in the face. Royal, meanwhile, recalled Diz's instructions from earlier. She had told him that when she touched her right ear, he was to say "what" and put pressure on the realtor. She explained that in the clergy, everyone hid their true intentions behind smiles, and realtors were almost certainly trying to overcharge them. It was a simple negotiation tactic. Diz then boldly asserted that exorcising a high-ranking wraith would cost at least 2 million yen, and she scoffed at the 150,000 yen monthly rent. Zanbi, desperate to appease the terrifying Royal, stammered out a new price of 100,000 yen. Royal repeated his menacing "what?" causing Zanbi to drop the price to 80,000, then 60,000, and finally reluctantly to 50,000 yen per month. With their base of operations acquired, they walked back out into the street. Royal asked if he had overdone the performance, recalling how Zanbi had literally cried while begging for his life. Diz admitted it was a bit harsh but argued that 50,000 yen was fair given the property's state. A high-ranking wraith was a threat far beyond the capabilities of an ordinary cleric. She tapped his shoulder, informing him that their next task was to begin the exorcism. Low-level specters or ghosts are formed by the negative emotions left behind by deceased humans or animals, transforming lingering regrets, anger, or sorrow into monsters. Their presence alone causes chills, nausea, and deep depressive feelings in anyone nearby. However, when hundreds or thousands of these entities coalesce into a single being, they form a high-level specter known as a wraith. Such a creature harbors clear hostility toward any intruder and is considered an extremely powerful and dangerous monster. They eventually arrived at the estate, a place fittingly known as the Haunted Mansion. It was an isolated house situated on the outskirts of town, looking every bit the part of a cursed residence. Diz turned to Royal and asked for his thoughts. Noting that there are various types of wraiths, trembling with visible fear, she wondered aloud if this particular spirit might be exceptionally malevolent. She cursed under her breath, reconsidering if even the 30,000 yen rent was worth the risk. She questioned him again, noting that even a high-ranking priest might struggle to cleanse such a place. Royal, still struggling to find his words, reflected on the mention of high-ranking priests. He recalled a vivid delusion where a woman addressed him as "Your Excellency." In that vision, it was Diz, begging him to lend them his strength and admitting that they were powerless against the wraith. This image shifted, and he remembered the moment Diz had originally invited him to form a party. In his mind, the scene transformed further. He saw himself wearing a priest's uniform, and the girl was no longer Diz, but a figure named Rabel. Even though it was a mere delusion, Royal felt a pang of guilt toward the real Diz for the mental substitution. In the physical world, Royal began to cast a complex spell designed to eradicate evil. He unleashed the incantation toward the mansion, and the wraith within became visibly terrified upon sensing the oncoming power. A blinding light flooded the estate as the wraith let out a final, agonizing scream. Watching from behind, Diz muttered that his power was just as amazing as she expected. She reflected on his performance, wondering if he had utilized abbreviated chanting, a high-level technique that compresses magical power to activate a spell instantly. Such a skill was reserved for the top few percent of the magician's hierarchy. She looked at Royal, wondering who exactly this man was, especially since he claimed to be a novice starting his life in the city. Royal looked back at her, and after several seconds of stuttering, he managed to ask if the place would be fine now. Diz repeated his word, probably, before agreeing. Royal scratched the back of his head, and reiterated his hope that it was settled. Diz chuckled, slapping him on the back as she thanked him, remarking that he truly was a good person. When they entered the mansion, they found spider webs draped over every surface. Diz awkwardly scratched her face, noting that the place was definitely in need of a deep cleaning. She suggested they focus on the dining area and their sleeping quarters for now, so they could hold a celebration for their new home. Royal agreed, and they worked together to prepare the space. As they labored, they talked about their future, the kinds of adventures they would seek, and the quests they would undertake. It was a genuinely joyful experience. When the sun rose the next morning, Royal woke feeling refreshed. He reflected on the previous night's drinking party, noting it was the first he had ever experienced, and that it had been deeply fulfilling. Downstairs, a girl wearing a witch's hat called out to see if anyone was home. Royal heard the voice as he descended the stairs, and wondered if they had a visitor. He speculated if it might be a neighbor, perhaps even a beautiful girl, but quickly dismissed the thought as wishful thinking. Nevertheless, he found himself suddenly nervous. Upon opening the door, he was surprised to find a young woman holding a magic wand and wearing a traditional witch's hat. The girl introduced herself politely, apologizing for the unannounced visit. She explained that she had something to ask, noting that a powerful wraith used to inhabit this location. When Royal confirmed this, she explained that she had been nearby the previous day and sensed an enormous surge of magical energy. She deduced that since he was living there now, he must have been the one to perform the exorcism. She remarked that the magic didn't feel like a holy spell, yet it possessed incredible power for simple exorcism magic. Before she could ask her favor, Royal retreated inside and quickly closed the door. The girl called out through the wood, asking if she could come in and talk for a bit. Royal leaned against the door, his heart racing, thinking to himself that this newcomer was terrifying. The girl continued to knock, calling out hello and excuse me. While inside, Royal covered his ears and repeated a single word in his mind. Scary, 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 scary. The following day, Royal recounted the encounter with the mysterious girl to Diz. She reacted with casual indifference, simply acknowledging that the event had occurred. When Royal questioned her brief response, Diz affirmed that she didn't have much else to say, though she expressed a desire to meet the girl herself the next time she appeared. Shifting the focus, she suggested they spend the day shopping. Royal, surprised, asked if they weren't heading straight into a dungeon. Diz explained that they were far from prepared and needed to gather essential supplies first. She gestured to her own attire, and Royal silently agreed. Her thin sister's vestments offered practically zero defensive performance. He realized he lacked even the basic knowledge of the adventuring trade, and as Diz suggested, needed to get his own equipment in order before facing any real danger. They made their way to a weapon and item shop. After Diz changed into more suitable adventuring gear and donned a pair of gauntlets, Royal watched her, thinking to himself how charming she looked. She informed him that their next priority was a magic bag. She described it as an essential tool that allowed adventurers to store large items with ease, completely negating their weight. Since such items were only found at specialized tool shops, they set off immediately. Upon finding one, Diz admired the various bags, pointing out several other tools she had always wanted to own. As the supplies continued to pile up, Royal wondered silently if he had actually contributed anything useful to their preparations so far. Finally, Diz announced that they were ready to head to the guild to officially register. The Adventurers Guild was a lively, bustling hub. As they stepped inside, Royal marveled at the atmosphere, though he felt the weight of the surrounding gazes. Feeling intimidated, he pulled on his helmet, hoping to shield himself from the attention. They were welcomed by Mocha, the guild receptionist, who inquired how she could assist them. Diz stated their intent to register as adventurers and to officially form their party. Mocha nodded in understanding, but requested that Royal remove his helmet for the process. As Royal apologized and complied, Mocha found herself blushing. To her eyes, he appeared remarkably handsome, radiating an unexpected charm. Confused by her sudden reaction, Royal asked if something was wrong, but Mocha quickly dismissed it and proceeded with the paperwork. Mocha provided a detailed explanation of the guild's ranking system, the nature of quests, and other administrative protocols. With the formalities complete, Royal and Diz were officially recognized as adventurers. When Mocha asked for their party name, the two shared a meaningful look. Diz announced their choice, Altura Vita. Royal reflected on the name, which they had chosen the night before. Since both had been dismissed from their previous lives, it represented the other life they were now beginning together. Mocha praised the name and presented them with their adventurer tags, warning them that a fee would be required should they ever lose them. As they donned their tags, Royal stared at his, overwhelmed by the realization that his path had truly changed. He had spent 15 years believing he would be a gatekeeper until the end of his days. He noticed Mocha waving at him and assumed she was simply being kind to ease his nerves. Nearby, a man with a distinct horn on his forehead named Miguel sat with his own party. One of his companions remarked that their current prospects seemed poor, noting that even a mighty demon like Miguel was having a run of bad luck. However, when Miguel's gaze landed on Royal, he was struck by a terrifyingly powerful aura. Breaking into a cold sweat, Miguel muttered that the large man looked seriously dangerous. His companion agreed, suggesting that they should perhaps call off whatever they had planned, as no one would blame Miguel for retreating from such a formidable opponent. Miguel sighed, realizing that fleeing wasn't an option. With a heavy sense of obligation, he declared that they had no choice but to proceed. Miguel stood up and approached the pair, inquiring if they had only just completed their registration. Diz affirmed that they had, and asked if he required something of them. Miguel introduced himself, stating that he had business with them and requested a moment of their time. Royal silently observed the man, noting his worn leather armor and the well-maintained longsword strapped to his waist. Miguel was an imposing figure, taller even than Royal, and exuded the unmistakable aura of a seasoned veteran. Royal wondered what such a man could want. Had they somehow offended him? He felt he should say something, but before he could find his voice, Diz agreed to the man's request. Grateful for the cooperation, Miguel led them toward a sparring ring. Nearby, other adventurers watched from the sidelines and the floor above. One spectator on the second level remarked that this was the usual initiation for newcomers, while another noted that these particular rookies were unlucky to be handled by Miguel. Miguel turned to Diz and Royal, apologizing for the necessity of the situation. He explained that it was a guild tradition for seniors to spar with new recruits to test their mettle. As Royal stepped forward to accept the challenge, Miguel asked for his name. Royal introduced himself, thinking silently that he could not continue to rely solely on Diz. He had to pull his own weight. He readied his spear, though a wave of doubt washed over him. He had barely used a spear before, yet he knew that if he unleashed Omni Kawis, the Pierce of All spell that had incinerated the High Orcs, Miguel would likely be torn to pieces. He needed a different approach. Memory of an old daydream flickered through his mind. He recalled standing before a stone tablet that read, "Here lies Balor of the Evil Eye." In the dream, a young woman had tapped his shoulder, remarking on the sinister atmosphere. He had promised to block every attack and spell, entrusting the offense to her. She had urged him not to die, and he had silenced her with a finger to her lips, confidently assuring her of his protection. As a gigantic demon manifested in his memory, he recalled summoning his strongest defensive barriers: Omni no Nomarist, the absolute inviolability, and Separatio Lux, the isolated space. In the present, Miguel gripped his sword, suddenly unnerved. He wondered why the atmosphere had shifted so drastically. From the balcony, other adventurers jeered, asking if he was scared, and telling him to get on with it. Miguel clicked his tongue, annoyed that those not facing the pressure were so quick to judge, but he knew he had no choice. He lunged forward, swinging his blade with veteran precision. Royal watched the sword approach in what felt like slow motion. He wondered desperately if his defensive spell had actually activated. If it hadn't, he was a dead man. His magic had worked against orcs and wraiths, but he was unsure if it would hold against a human warrior of Miguel's caliber. To his immense shock, the attack was deflected by an invisible force before it could touch him. The sheer momentum of the redirected impact threw Miguel across the ring, where he crashed into the wooden boundary and fell unconscious. Relieved, Royal wiped the sweat from his brow, realizing he had been saved by his own imagination once again. For a gatekeeper, the ultimate nemesis is not a marauding beast, but the mosquito. Once one of those pests manages to slip inside a suit of full-plate armor, the battle is lost. They are free to inflict a one-sided torment upon their trapped victim. Royal recalled gritting his teeth and enduring the maddening itch, viewing those tiny insects as more terrifying than any legendary monster. Yet one day, they had simply ceased their attacks. At the time, he had chalked it up to luck, but looking back now, he realized he must have subconsciously manifested his absolute impenetrable isolation space. As he gazed at the unconscious Miguel, he felt a wave of profound gratitude that a spell originally conceived purely for mosquito prevention had functioned so effectively in a duel. Diz called out his name and threw her arms around him in a joyful embrace, exhilarated by his victory. As she clung to him, Royal offered a silent prayer of thanks to the mosquitoes of his past for making this moment possible. High above on the second floor, the seasoned adventurers remained in a state of awe, whispering about how he had neutralized Miguel in a mere heartbeat. The atmosphere shifted as a man dressed in the traditional garb of a samurai entered the ring. He addressed Royal with gravity, noting that he appeared to be a knight of great renown. Introducing himself as Muniyoshi, a traveling seeker of strength, he drew murmurs from the crowd who clearly recognized his name. Royal, breaking into a nervous sweat, realized that yet another formidable individual had crossed his path. Muniyoshi formally requested a duel, but Royal waved his hands frantically, stammering that he was truly not as great as he seemed. Muniyoshi slowly began to unsheath his blade, remarking that to possess such power and remain humble was the mark of a true master. In a blur of motion, he closed the distance, resting his blade against Royal's neck. He noted that even with a sword at his throat, Royal remained unruffled. In reality, Royal was paralyzed. He hadn't even seen the man move. Muniyoshi stepped back and assumed a combative stance, commanding Royal to prepare himself. Observing that Royal remained stationary, Muniyoshi questioned his lack of a guard. Royal simply let his spear clatter to the floor, stating that it was in the way and ultimately not needed. To the onlookers, his voice carried a menacing, arrogant weight. Internally, Royal was panicking. The spear was useless in his hands and only served to clutter his movements, but his stuttering made his explanation come across as a cold boast. Muniyoshi laughed, invigorated by what he perceived as a tone of supreme confidence, noting that he was nothing like the opponents Royal had faced earlier. Royal managed to reply that both Muniyoshi and Miguel were not different, which visibly annoyed the samurai. Royal had intended to say that since both men were vastly stronger than him, he couldn't distinguish between their power levels, but the nuance was lost in translation. Feeling underestimated, Muniyoshi prepared a strike, but before he could move, Diz charged in. She delivered a crushing punch directly to his face, sending the samurai flying across the ring until he was wedged into the wooden boundary. While While Royal stood frozen in shock, Diz casually explained that since Muniyoshi didn't seem like the type to listen to reason, she decided a physical intervention would be faster. Royal marveled at her strength. He knew she was confident, but he hadn't imagined her to be a powerhouse. He made a mental note never to truly anger her. Later that evening, the tension dissolved into a boisterous welcome party. Royal and Diz sat with Miguel, while Mocha served them drinks. Miguel explained the true purpose of the initiation. Many rookies arrive with nothing but hollow overconfidence, leading them to lose their lives needlessly. The sparring was meant to humble them, though he admitted Royal clearly required no such lesson. As the other adventurers began to slump over the tables in a drunken stupor, Royal sat quietly to the side, observing the scene. He felt a sense of belonging, thinking that if everyone was this kind, he might actually survive this new life. His peaceful reflection was interrupted by the girl who had visited the mansion. She approached him tentatively, apologizing for her behavior the previous day. Royal struggled to place her until she donned her witch's hat, sparking his memory. She bowed her head deeply, expressing regret for scaring him with her persistent knocking. Royal assured her it was fine, realizing she wasn't the threat he had imagined. The girl asked if the display she had just witnessed was indeed magic. Removing her hat, she leaned in close, her eyes filled with an intense plea as she begged him to take her on as his apprentice. The young girl asserted that while the spectators at the guild believed Royal had blocked Miguel's strike with his armor, she knew the truth. She pressed him, asking if it was actually magic, while Royal silently questioned whether the powers he wielded could even be defined as such. She continued her interrogation, asking if the purification of the high-ranking wraith the previous day was also his doing. She revealed that she had witnessed the exorcism personally, and clutching her hat, bowed her head once more, pleading for him to accept her as his disciple. Royal reflected privately that his success was a fluke. He had simply used a power that happened to work, and it wasn't something he could teach. He knew he had to decline, but he wanted to do so without causing offense. He managed to utter that it was still too early, but the weight of his voice terrified the girl. Her eyes welled with tears before she stood and bolted toward the exit, shouting that she would improve. Royal wondered if he had been misunderstood. The girl paused at the door, declaring she would never give up until he acknowledged her, before vanishing from the guild. As Royal sipped his drink, he fretted over his phrasing. He had meant it was too early for him to take on a student, but he doubted that sentiment had been conveyed. Meanwhile, inside the guildmaster's office, the leader inquired about the quality of the day's new recruits. Mocha replied enthusiastically that the new knight was remarkably handsome. The guildmaster clarified that he was asking about their capabilities as adventurers, not their looks. Mocha demonstrated with excitement how Royal had effortlessly defeated Miguel, lamenting that she hadn't seen the cool display herself. When asked about Royal's companion, Mocha described Diz's attire as that of a martial artist, likely with ties to the church. The guildmaster decided they should observe the pair for the time being, and Mocha happily agreed to keep a close watch. Once she left, the guildmaster stared out his window, silently hoping that no complications would arise. That evening, Royal recounted the encounter to Diz. When she asked for his impression of the girl, Royal described her as a confused rookie who looked like a magician. Diz let out a heavy sigh and informed him that the girl was actually a top-tier adventurer, likely the most powerful magician in town. Royal was stunned. Diz explained that the girl was a celebrity often featured in the adventurer's newspaper, possessing the talent of a court magician and equipped with the finest gear available. Diz asked if he understood why the girl had looked so frustrated. She pointed out the absurdity of the situation. A world-class magician had begged to be his student, and Royal had told her she wasn't skilled enough yet. Royal panicked as the gravity of his accidental insult set in. Diz burst into laughter, finding the situation hilarious and telling Royal he was truly one of a kind. She reassured him that the girl seemed decent and suggested they speak to her properly next time. Acknowledging that Royal hadn't socialized for 15 years, she promised to act as his partner and help him practice his communication skills. The following morning finally arrived, the day of their first dungeon dive. Royal offered a nervous sigh, prompting Diz to ask if he was still dwelling on the previous day's events. She encouraged him to enjoy the experience, noting that a first dungeon visit was a special occasion. Royal agreed, trying to find his resolve. The guild was crowded with adventurers swarming the quest board. Diz remarked on the morning rush and suggested they arrive earlier in the future. Their plans were suddenly interrupted when an adventurer burst through the doors, shouting a dire warning. A stampede had begun. A massive horde of orcs had appeared in the Est Forest. Diz smirked, her eyes alight with anticipation as she stated that the dungeon would have to wait. A stampede is a critical catastrophe, a relentless surge of monsters descending upon a civilization. During his 15 years guarding the northern gate of Sakuran, Royal had been trained to prepare for such an event from the northern woods, but it had never occurred. Eventually, the threat felt more like a myth than a reality. Inside the guild, as panic began to ripple through the crowd, Diz remarked on the sheer scale of the commotion. A stampede of this magnitude typically only happened once every few decades. Royal nodded, managing to utter that it was his first time witnessing one. Diz confessed it was her first experience as well. The guildmaster suddenly appeared, silencing the room to issue an emergency request. He confirmed that a massive horde of high orcs had been sighted in the Est Forest, numbering approximately 60. A cold sweat broke out among the gathered adventurers. As the guildmaster continued, he reminded them that the strength of a single high orc is incomparable to a standard orc. Even a veteran B-rank adventurer could barely manage one in a one-on-one duel. A single high orc could level an entire village, and now 60 were marching toward the city. He asserted that if they allowed allowed this march to continue, Melky would surely fall, but he vowed they would protect their home. He rallied them, stating that compared to dragons or wraiths, these were merely orcs, and by combining their strength, victory was certain. The speech successfully ignited the adventurers' morale. They roared in agreement, ready to crush the horde and defend the city. The guildmaster informed them that the forest was a half-day's journey away, and ordered everyone to mobilize immediately. As the guild emptied, Diz turned to Royal and asked for their next move. Royal reflected silently. As brand new adventurers, they weren't technically required to answer the emergency call. Furthermore, having recently incinerated high orcs, the prospect wasn't particularly novel. He admitted to Diz that he still wanted to go to the dungeon. Diz laughed at his bluntness, but noted that the dungeons would likely be inaccessible until the crisis was resolved. She suggested they head to the Est Forest as well, noting that with their combined power, they could end the battle quickly. Royal agreed, and Diz grasped his hand, encouraging him to show her his impressive side. Royal paused, his mind working. The report claimed there were 60 high orcs, but he felt he needed more accurate intelligence. Recalling the magic he used to save Flora's carriage, he asked Diz to step back. He placed his hand firmly upon the ground and cast Mundus Cove, the invisible hand that covers the world. A massive magical shockwave rippled out for miles, scouting the terrain until he located the enemy. Diz stood speechless at the display, asking what he had just done. Royal explained it was the same detection magic he had used before. His scouting revealed a grim reality. While the initial herd heading for the town numbered 62, nearly matching the guildmaster's report, there was a second, much larger force trailing behind. Another 205 high orcs were lurking in the shadows. Royal realized the first group was likely a decoy. If the main force was over 200 strong, the guild's units, who were already desperate at the thought of 60, would be utterly annihilated. He gently pushed Diz aside and commanded her to stay back. As magic began to swirl around his hand, a deep resolve took hold of him. He could not allow his new home or the people who had welcomed him to be wiped out. Summoning multiple massive magic circles, he launched Pierce through everything into the sky, the projectiles arcing upward to track their distant targets. When the adventurer arrived at the Est Forest, they were dumbfounded to find nothing but scorched earth and the drifting ashes of the orc horde. Back at the guild, Royal looked at his hand and breathed a silent sigh of relief that the spell had activated successfully. He prayed that everyone was safe. Meanwhile, at the edge of the forest, the guildmaster stood amidst the sudden silence, staring at the empty blackened ground in total shock, wondering what had just happened. Diz asked with a sense of lingering disbelief if the threat was truly over. Royal confirmed it was, noting the situation mirrored their encounter with Flora's carriage. While Diz found the feat incredible, she questioned if they should report their involvement to the guild. Royal immediately disagreed. Diz scratched the back of her head, conceding that even if they did come forward, the authorities likely wouldn't believe them. With the guild undoubtedly preoccupied with the aftermath of the stampede, she figured they could leave the rest to the professionals. At that moment, the young girl in the witch hat approached them once again. She apologized for being a nuisance, but reiterated her desperate plea for Royal to take her as his apprentice. Diz realized this was the girl Royal had mentioned earlier, and learned her name was Sandy. After introducing herself and Royal, Diz encouraged Royal to speak with Sandy privately to settle the matter. Steeling himself, Royal stutteringly asked why she was so insistent. Sandy confessed that it was love at first sight, causing Royal to flush deep red. His mind raced as he recalled the cynical translations of social interactions he had studied in books to avoid being hurt. He reminded himself that in his experience, "You're a good person" usually meant, "I don't see you as a man," and "Are you free this weekend?" was just a prelude to being asked to cover someone's shift. However, Sandy quickly clarified, with a blush of her own, that she had fallen in love at first sight with his magic. Royal breathed a silent sigh of relief. Had he misunderstood her intent, the emotional blow would have been devastating. Sandy gushed about the ultimate magic he had used to wipe out the stampede, and the phrase resonated deeply with Royal. He drifted into a daydream of himself and a team of 3 female comrades facing a colossal foe. In his mind, he had commanded them to buy him time while he prepared his final strike, eventually defeating the enemy in a single glorious blast. His imaginary comrades had showered him with praise. Snapping back to reality, Royal realized he was standing there drooling like an idiot. He reflected that despite Sandy's elite reputation, she was still just a child who admired cool ultimate techniques, a sentiment he could deeply relate to. Sandy waited expectantly for her master to respond. Royal apologized and tried to explain that it was impossible for him to teach her. When Sandy mentioned she was the top apprentice to the head court magician, Royal suggested that such a mentor was far better than he could ever be. Sandy adamantly disagreed. Royal tried to tell her he simply didn't know how to teach, but Sandy jumped to the conclusion that he was protecting a forbidden one successor only technique. Royal didn't want to lie, but he didn't know how to explain his situation. He looked to Diz for help, but her smirk made it clear she was enjoying the spectacle and had no intention of intervening. Finally, Royal confessed the truth. He didn't even understand why he could use magic himself. Sandy, far from being deterred, was amazed. Assuming he had developed original magic, she bowed her head once more, begging for his tutelage. Seeing her determination, Royal called out to Diz, who gave Sandy a thumbs up and declared she was all for it. Royal realized Diz just found the situation entertaining, but since Sandy didn't seem like a bad person, he reluctantly agreed. Sandy beamed with joy, thanking her new master profusely. With their party expanded, Diz suggested they return to the mansion to measure Royal's mana capacity. Once back at the base, she produced a measuring measuring device. Royal recalled his only previous measurement from his time with the Knights, where his score had been a measly single digit. He hoped that his recent displays of power meant his capacity had finally increased. Diz went first, placing the device in her mouth. Sandy watched with high expectations for her master, but when Diz finished, the device read only 12. Considering a beginner mage usually scores between 50 and 100, Diz lamented her total lack of talent, wondering why she had ever been considered a saint candidate. Sandy went next, scoring over 800, a figure Diz called impressive, noting that anyone surpassing 1000 was destined for history books. Then it was Royal's turn. He looked at the device, hesitating since Diz had just used it, but she brushed off his concern and told him to hurry up. Blushing, Royal put the device in his mouth. It began to beep frantically, before displaying a solid 9,999. Diz was shocked to her core. The device only had 4 digits, meaning Royal's true capacity was likely over 10,000. Sandy beamed, finding the result exactly as expected of her master, but Diz immediately took charge. She ordered them to keep this result an absolute secret. Royal agreed, fearing that such abnormal power would lead to him being imprisoned or turned into a test subject. Diz then laid down the law. Because his magic was on a superhuman level, what he considered normal would be outrageous to everyone else. She strictly forbade him from using any of his prepared cool lines, such as "Did I mess up?" or "Anyone can do this, right?" Royal felt a wave of disappointment. All the humble protagonist-style lines he had dreamed of saying for 15 years were now officially banned. With a heavy heart, he simply answered, "Yes." It was evening at the Adventurers Guild. Royal stood before the quest board, while Diz and Sandy finalized the paperwork to officially integrate Sandy into their group. With the formalities complete, Altera Vita had grown to 3 members. Royal inquired about their status, and Diz explained that while they were still barred from entering high-level dungeons, they were now eligible to accept F-rank requests. Royal shows them the request he picked. When the two saw it, they realized it was a ghost extermination task. Diz snatched the paper, noting that it was an excellent find with a remarkably high payout. Royal reflected on the disparity. While typical F-rank tasks offered a mere 2,000 to 3,000 yen, this one promised 20,000. He harbored a silent fear that the high reward implied something truly terrifying, but Sandy assured him that with a master of his caliber, there was nothing to fear. Diz insisted that the final decision rested with him, but reminded him that if they took the job, he would have to take the lead. Trembling, Royal accepted the challenge, knowing he needed to practice interacting with the guild staff. As he approached the counter, Mocha noticed his hesitation and asked if something was wrong. Royal tried to speak, but his throat tightened. His mouth simply refused to cooperate. Sensing his distress, Mocha kindly asked if he wished to accept a request and requested his form and adventurer tag. Royal struggled to remove the tag from his neck, fumbling with the clasp. Mocha offered to help, asking him to crouch down so she could reach. As she worked on the tricky latch, she found herself blushing, eventually wiping away a bead of sweat once the tag was freed. She promised to handle the paperwork and waved him off, telling him to never hesitate to ask for her help again. When Royal returned to his team, Diz noted his somber expression despite having successfully accepted the quest. Royal side-glanced at Mocha and stuttered a vague suspicion. Diz immediately caught his drift, but Royal's internal thoughts were far more cynical. He suspected Mocha had ulterior motives, acting kindly only to burden them with troublesome tasks or use them for her own convenience. Diz quickly corrected him. She pointed out that Mocha usually ignored other male adventurers and seemed genuinely interested in Royal. She explained that his strength and honesty made him a magnet for attention, adding that he was actually quite handsome, a fact he had seemingly failed to notice. Royal trembled with embarrassment. Diz teased that if he hadn't worn a helmet for the last 15 years, his life would have been a constant hassle, speculating that his old colleagues might have been jealous of his looks. Royal felt a silent surge of regret. He wished someone had told him this 15 years ago. Diz clarified that she wasn't with him just for his appearance. She claimed to dislike men who only had their looks, but warned him that he likely wouldn't be left alone from now on. Sandy chimed in, telling her master to be careful, and Royal resolved to leave the past behind and embrace his new life to the fullest. Upon arriving at the cemetery for the extermination, Royal questioned the high reward again. Diz explained the economics. Ghosts are typically defeated with holy water, which costs 1,000 yen per bottle. Since about 10 ghosts appeared nightly, the expenses usually ate up a large chunk of the reward. It was a rookie job designed to help newcomers earn money, though its creepy nature deterred most. However, with Royal in the party, they stood to make a massive profit. Diz went to greet the client, a man with heavy bags under his eyes who handed over the cemetery key through a window. He was skeptical, demanding they do the job properly. As the team entered the graveyard, Diz sensed something was off. Royal wondered if a high-level spirit was lurking, and cast Mundus Cove to reveal any hidden entities. He called out to Sandy, who activated her wand. Royal marveled at seeing real magic in action, while Sandy was equally awestruck that her master could reveal the glowing spirits so effortlessly. However, the spirits were not attacking, they were fading. Diz realized that the residual power from Royal's previous wraith exorcism at their mansion had purified the entire surrounding area. The land was so clean that no ghosts would appear for at least a year. Royal had inadvertently over-exorcised the site, effectively taking away jobs from future adventurers. Royal began to apologize, fearing he had messed up again, but Diz gave him a thumbs up. She told him not to worry, they just had to frame the result correctly to the client. Diz returned to the client's house and announced the job was finished. The man who was drinking was incredulous that they were back in less than 10 minutes and ordered them back to work. In response, Diz pulled a cross from her chest pocket. The man gasped, asking if she was an inquisitor. Royal watched from the sidelines, recalling that inquisitors were elite agents sent by the Holy Church to root out wrongdoing. He had seen them a few times while guarding the gate, but he found himself wondering, was Diz actually one of them? Diz assured the man that she had no intention of reporting his laziness or scolding him for his neglect. Instead, she demanded a single favor. Royal watched from the sidelines, his mind racing with the knowledge that impersonating a church inspector was a crime punishable by execution. He wrestled with the possibility that Diz might actually be the real deal, but ultimately decided to place his trust in her. The man asked what she required, and Diz led him back to the cemetery, pointing out the absolute lack of malevolent energy. She explained that for a long while, no spirits would haunt this ground, and the man realized that ghosts wouldn't be appearing for some time. Diz then revealed her request. He was to continue posting the ghost hunting quests exactly as before, specifically for the benefit of new adventurers who were short on money. She showed him the cross and noted that she was counting on his sincerity. Terrified by the sight of the symbol and her authority, the man quickly agreed without a second thought. He signed the completion form immediately, eager to comply. As the trio returned to the guild, Diz stretched her arms, satisfied that they had not only finished the job, but also preserved a necessary source of income for future rookies. Royal took the opportunity to ask if she truly was an inspector. With a mischievous glint in her eye, Diz stuck out her tongue, admitting the man had simply jumped to his own conclusions. She noted that as she was practically family to the church, the worst she would face if caught was a stern scolding. Royal recalled his days at the gate, where church officials were treated with such reverence that they bypassed all security checks. He realized just how much influence she was wielding. They celebrated their success with a round of food and drinks. As Royal watched his companions, he felt a rare sense of peace. When Diz asked how he was enjoying the adventurer's life, Royal tallied the chaos of the last few days: a decennial stampede, gaining an elite apprentice, discovering his godlike mana capacity, and the bluff at the cemetery. He stutteringly replied that it was fun. Diz was thrilled, suggesting they continue raising their ranks, while Sandy declared it the best day of her life. The next morning at their base, Royal decided that enjoying the adventurer's life required one more thing: better social skills. He began studying a book titled Conversation Techniques for Popularity. When Sandy greeted him in the hallway, he decided to put the theory into practice. He responded to her morning greeting with a practiced, calm demeanor. When Sandy expressed worry that her sudden appearance might be a burden, Royal used a technique from the book, telling her he had been looking forward to her arrival. Sandy beamed, her eyes sparkling with relief. When Royal questioned if he was truly worthy of being her master, Sandy insisted that her ability to analyze magic told her everything she needed to know. She vowed to master his techniques, noting that it felt much easier to talk to him today. Royal was elated. The book was working. He began to wonder if between his newfound communication skills and his apparently handsome face, he might actually become popular. The group eventually made their way to the town's west gate to head toward the dungeon. The female gatekeeper recognized Royal's former uniform and asked if he was from the Sakuran Knights. When he confirmed he had been a gatekeeper, she immediately labeled him an elite. Royal tried to protest, knowing the North Gate was the loneliest post in the world, but the woman was already starstruck. She asked to shake his hand, blushing furiously, and declaring she would never wash it again. She convinced herself that his presence there was part of a top-secret mission, and promised to keep his secret before waving them through with a respectful bow. As they passed through, Royal puffed with frustration. While things had gone well with Sandy, he had been unable to correct the gatekeeper's wild misunderstandings. Diz gave him a playful nudge, teasing him about his elite status, before telling him it was time to shift gears. They were finally standing before their true goal, the Dungeon of Beginnings. Royal took a deep breath, realizing that as the leader, he had to keep himself together for Diz and Sandy's sake. Their real test was about to begin. Numerous dungeons surround the city of Melki, serving as natural gathering spots for monsters. While the primary attraction for veterans is the high-difficulty Great Melki Labyrinth, Royal and his party stood before the Dungeon of Beginnings. It was common knowledge among locals that if a person couldn't clear this site, they should abandon their dreams of adventuring entirely. Diz noted that Royal looked uncharacteristically happy. He admitted he had been looking forward to this moment for years. Their conversation was interrupted by Miguel and his two companions, who approached from behind. Miguel inquired if they were heading to the demi-human den, but Diz clarified that as F-rankers, they were sticking to the beginner's dungeon. Royal asked about the den, and Miguel explained it was a B-rank nest teeming with goblins and minotaurs located right next to their destination. With a final warning for Royal not to let his guard down, Miguel's party went their separate way. The trio descended into the Dungeon of Beginnings. The halls were eerie and silent, likely due to the previous day's stampede drawing adventurers elsewhere. Royal tried to suppress his excitement, reminding himself to stay calm. They soon reached a chamber where Diz, eager for action, wondered what awaited them. Inside were 3 slimes, the weakest of all monsters. Royal reflected on the adventure tales he had read, where defeating slimes was the standard rite of passage. The battle was swift. Diz obliterated one with a single punch, while Sandy incinerated another with a fireball. Royal, not yet mentally prepared, froze as the 3rd slime lunged at him. He instinctively shielded himself, subconsciously activating his absolute inviolable barrier field. field. The slime collided with the barrier and exploded instantly. When Royal opened his eyes, Sandy marveled at how her master could turn a defensive spell into such a destructive counterattack. After the skirmish, Diz gathered 2 magic stones from the remains. Seeing Royal's confusion, she explained that dungeon monsters drop these stones upon defeat. She asked if he knew why most people became adventurers. While Royal suggested romance and freedom, Diz grounded him in reality. She admitted she had left the church for freedom, but for the majority the goal was profit. She revealed that it would take 10 of these low-level stones just to buy a single loaf of bread. Royal apologized for the meager start, but Diz encouraged him, noting that slimes were easy to handle without wasting resources. In the next room, however, Royal's physical limitations became apparent. He attempted to punch a slime but missed wildly, face planting into the dirt. As Sandy and Diz efficiently cleared the room, Royal continued to struggle, missing strike after strike and repeatedly hitting the ground. Even the slimes seemed to look at him with a glimmer of pity before attacking again. Frustrated and determined, Royal realized that physical combat was not his forte. He mumbled that he had to do things his own way, and activated Pierce Through Everything. He fired the spell at the remaining 3 slimes, vaporizing them instantly. Sandy was awestruck, but Diz stared in horror at the massive train tunnel-sized hole Royal had blasted through the dungeon wall. She warned him that dungeon walls weren't meant to be damaged so easily, and while the dungeon would eventually regenerate, he needed to seal that spell until he could control its output. Royal doubted his ability to do so, but Diz offered her unwavering confidence in him. Deciding to make use of the shortcut, the group crouched through the long, jagged tunnel Royal had created. Sandy's heart pounded at the sheer audacity of walking through a hole in a dungeon wall, a feat she had never heard of before. After a long trek, they emerged into a series of deeper chambers, passing through rooms of slimes until they reached a much larger area. There they were confronted by a massive goblin. It turned its head toward them, its voice a guttural roar as it demanded to know who they were and where they had come from. Facing the towering goblin and its grotesque subordinates, Royal felt a wave of intense pressure that seemed entirely out of place. He stutteringly questioned if the boss of a beginner's dungeon was truly supposed to exude such an overwhelming aura. Diz simply noted that it was a goblin, leading Royal to reflect silently that, despite their fearsome appearance, these were merely the introductory hurdles of his new career. He convinced himself that even if they looked formidable, they were still just goblins meant for novice training. The massive creature roared and swung its heavy weapon, but the trio managed to dive out of the way. With a guttural command, the leader ordered its underlings to tear the intruders apart. Diz immediately instructed Royal to handle the situation. He activated his absolute inviolable isolation barrier around himself. Noting that after wading through a sea of slimes to reach this chamber, he had finally developed a rhythm. He decided to push himself slightly harder than he had with the slimes, curious to see how these more substantial monsters would fare against his defenses. A chaotic swarm of goblins rushed him, unleashing a barrage of arrows, daggers, swords, and magic. Royal ignored the onslaught, casually jogging toward the central boss. Every goblin that made contact with his barrier was instantly obliterated as he passed. The goblin leader stared in disbelief, shouting that such a feat should be impossible, and demanding to know what Royal was. It boasted of the countless adventurers it had crushed under its weapon, furiously declaring that Royal would be the next to be buried in a single blow. Despite his fear, Royal commanded himself to remain composed. He reasoned that this was still a beginner's trial, a test of mental fortitude similar to his mock battle with Miguel. As the massive club descended toward him, he moved forward to meet the strike head-on. Upon the moment of impact, the huge goblin vanished into thin air, leaving no trace of its existence behind except for a single large magic stone. Royal retrieved the stone, noting silently that after an endless grind of slimes and lesser goblins, he had finally secured a significant drop. Diz congratulated him on the victory, pointing out that his magic was powerful enough to transmute a B-rank dungeon boss into a simple stone. Royal paused, his mind reeling as he asked if she had truly just identified this as a B-rank zone. Diz admitted she had sensed the atmospheric shift, but figured he could handle it without issue, and he had indeed neutralized the entire room in a single pass. Sandy bowed deeply, expressing her shock that he had defeated a king, an archer, and a magician while under the impression they were common pests. She thanked him for the honor of witnessing such mastery up close. Royal waved off the praise, crediting his companions for the success. He felt a rare surge of confidence. He was finally collecting magic stones and using his abilities effectively. He thanked them for their support and expressed his hope that they could continue as a team. With a warm smile, Diz reminded him that they still needed to find their way back to the starter dungeon to finalize their progress. The return journey was effortless. Royal simply ran through any remaining monsters with his barrier active until they reached the final chamber. For the first time, he beheld a dungeon treasure chest. Inside, they found a promotion medal forged with the image of a slime. Diz explained that presenting this to the guild would allow them to rank up from F to E, opening the door to extermination missions outside the city. Royal realized then why Diz had been so insistent on finishing the starter dungeon. Her foresight was impeccable. With the medal in hand, Altera Vita had officially conquered their first dungeon. The following day, they ventured into the Sass Forest. While most adventurers were busy investigating the site of the S Forest stampede, they had opted for the less crowded woods to complete a hunting quest and provide Sandy with magic training. Diz soon approached them, effortlessly carrying 3 horned rabbits she had caught. Royal marveled at her speed, but she dismissed the feat, noting they were only E-rank prey. Before he could offer a response, she caught sight of another target and vanished into the brush once again. Royal reflected on just how much Dies truly loved the thrill of combat, a stark contrast to her holy and gentle appearance. She soon returned with a massive fatted boar slung effortlessly over her shoulder, her face lit with a bright triumphant smile as she presented the kill. As they tucked the boar into their gathering basket, Dies suggested they venture deeper into the forest to hunt even larger monsters. Royal agreed, though he wondered silently if she had been suppressing a great deal of frustration during their relatively low-stakes dungeon run the day before. Once again, he found himself overwhelmed with a sense of gratitude for Dies' unwavering kindness and support. In the secluded clearings of the Sass Forest on the outskirts of Melki, Royal knelt to activate his detection magic. After a moment, he confirmed that they were entirely alone. Sandy noted that the lack of other adventurers made it a safe environment for him to practice without restraint, expressing her eagerness to witness his power firsthand. The Sass Forest was typically the domain of C-rank adventurers, but the recent stampede investigation had drawn them away to the Est Forest. In their absence, the area became a perfect training ground where Royal could potentially knock down trees or blast the earth without drawing unwanted attention. He confessed to Sandy that he felt he had little to teach her, but she remained steadfast, asking him to look after her. Royal reflected silently on how easy it was to forget that despite her youthful appearance, Sandy was a top-tier mage, an expert frequently featured in newspapers. Sandy admitted that while she specialized in magical analysis, his power remained an enigma she was determined to master. Royal resolved to work just as hard, identifying his primary struggle as output control. He needed to learn how to engage enemies without obliterating the dungeon itself, or erasing the valuable magic stones along with the monsters. He launched 3 magic bullets into the air, hoping to see them weaken, but Sandy pointed out that even his magic-restricting bracelet was no match for his raw power. Attempting to minimize the output further, he fired 2 more shots, only to freeze when he saw them punch a massive clear hole through the cloud layer. Sandy was awestruck by the scattered clouds, but Royal realized with a sinking heart that even this weakened attempt was too abnormal. Far away, other adventurers looked up in confusion, wondering why the sky had suddenly cleared. He transitioned to his defensive spell, the absolute inviolable isolated space. Having seen its destructive potential in the beginner dungeon, he decided to practice increasing the output this time. However, he failed to notice the intensifying pressure until Sandy collapsed. He rushed to her side, apologizing profusely. Sandy, breathless, confessed she felt as though she might die from the sheer density of his mana. Royal realized with horror that his barrier was less of a shield and more of a lethal weapon that could kill at a distance. As she recovered, Sandy suggested a new approach. He should try to deplete his massive mana pool entirely, to see if a lower state of power would make control easier to grasp. They trained for several hours until Diz returned. Waving a hand to announce her arrival, she boasted of finding worthy prey deep in the forest and asked about their progress. Royal admitted the training had been difficult. Sandy had pushed herself so hard trying to drain his mana that she had run out of strength. As they began the walk back to town with Sandy resting on Royal's back, Diz reassured them both that there was no need to rush on the first day. They headed to the dismantling area behind the guild, where Royal donned his helmet to hide his face from the bear-like beastman, Urs. The veteran dismantler recognized Sandy immediately, greeting her with a parental warmth as she introduced her new party. Royal presented their E-rank request, but Urs looked at the hall with suspicion, noting that the contents didn't match the rank of the mission. When Diz emptied her magic bag, the table was covered not just with horned rabbits and mad dogs, but a massive wyvern. Diz casually scratched her cheek, remarking that the forest was quite dangerous, and these monsters had simply attacked them in the shallow areas. Royal and Sandy hummed in agreement, trying to maintain the facade. Urs gave them a furious look, eventually telling them to avoid doing anything too flashy in the future. He informed them that an appraisal of this magnitude would take until morning. Back at the mansion, the air in the dining room was filled with an incredible aroma. Diz had prepared the fatted boar she hunted, which Sandy had roasted whole using her precise heat control. As they ate, Royal marveled at how the exterior was perfectly crispy while the meat remained juicy, a level of culinary magic he knew he could never achieve. Sandy admitted that while the day was educational, Royal's magic remained unlike anything she had ever seen. Diz noted that both of them had a long road of training ahead. Royal thanked Sandy, asserting that he only made progress because of her knowledge. Sandy beamed, admitting she felt the same and was happy they had spent the day talking. Diz watched them with a quiet, knowing smile. Meanwhile, inside the guildmaster's office, the atmosphere was far more tense. The guildmaster sat at his desk, staring at a report featuring Royal's likeness. He sighed heavily, muttering the names of Royal and Diz to himself. He scratched his head in frustration, wondering aloud who these people actually were and why they had chosen his town of all places. On the second day of magic training in the Sass Forest, Royal stood in a clearing, eyes squeezed shut in deep concentration. He attempted to manifest a shard of ice, but the air remained still and empty. The resulting silence was heavy and awkward. Sandy quickly assured him that he shouldn't worry, but Royal lowered his head, apologizing for being such such a pathetic master. He reflected silently on the nature of his abilities. The magic he could currently wield was all born from things he had vividly imagined in the past, which had simply worked the moment he tried them. He had assumed that by imagining new elements he could expand his repertoire, but he had spent the entire day failing to spark fire, earth, lightning, or ice. Sandy suggested that perhaps he could only trigger such magic when it was a matter of absolute necessity. Royal acknowledged the possibility, and as dusk settled over the forest, they decided to retreat and attempt a different method the following day. The third day focused on weakening his output, yet the results remained the same. His power was still too erratic to control. Diz eventually joined them, confirming she had finished her subjugation requests. When she mentioned she had ended up hunting over 10 B-rank monsters again, Royal's eyes widened. He noted that Urs at the dismantling area had been getting increasingly annoyed over the last few days. Diz admitted it was true, but explained that whenever the monsters appeared, she simply reacted and defeated them out of surprise. Royal understood her position. Since he still couldn't cast weak magic, he couldn't return to the dungeon and had no right to complain while Diz handled the forest requests. Gazing at his companions, Royal felt a deep yearning for the three of them to challenge a dungeon together again. He extended a finger toward a nearby tree, focusing every ounce of his will on restraint. He fired a tiny spark, and to his immense relief, it left only a small bullet-sized hole in the trunk. The two girls cheered and congratulated him. Royal felt a surge of silent triumph. With this, he could finally harvest magic stones from slimes without vaporizing them. He didn't care if others thought such a small feat was lame. To him, it was a monumental leap forward. He tried to thank Diz, but his voice cracked into a dry cough. Diz chuckled at his hoarseness and announced that starting tomorrow, they would return to the dungeons. Sandy assumed they were targeting an E-rank location to raise their rank steadily, but Diz hinted that she had a feeling things would work out differently. The following morning, Royal sat at a table with his two companions, struggling to keep his eyes open. He reflected silently on how he had stayed up late into the night, his mind racing with potential names and rhythmic chants for new magic. Because he had been so overwhelmed with excitement to test these new spells, he hadn't been able to sleep at all, a complete and utter mistake. To occupy his tired mind, he scanned the day's adventurer's report, noting that the demand for magic tool batteries was causing prices to surge. These batteries had become the essential energy source for the magic tools that had proliferated in recent years. It was a bitter reminder that Royal had been fired from his post as a gate guard specifically because the Night Order had replaced him with automated surveillance and interception systems. The report highlighted that the Verdun Deckel House held a strict monopoly on the production and distribution of these batteries, fueling growing public criticism toward the Duke. Royal wondered briefly how the Night Order was managing with their new systems, but then dismissed the thought. He had been fired, so whatever they did was no longer his concern. At the guild, Moker approached the group with a cheerful expression. She requested that Diz and Royal follow her to a private room, specifically asking Sandy to refrain from joining. Royal wondered silently what could be happening, as they had only just arrived to pick up a request. Inside the office, they were met by Gallop, the master of the Melky branch. He skipped the pleasantries, stating that the pair had been causing quite a scene. When Diz tried to play dumb, Gallop mentioned that Urs had been lodging formal complaints. Diz insisted she was just hunting rabbits, and that B-rank monsters kept appearing by coincidence. Gallop countered that coincidences don't happen 3 days in a row, but Diz remained firm, suggesting the world was full of mysteries, and that other E-rankers might soon find themselves facing high-rank monsters if things didn't change. Royal marveled silently at Diz's negotiation tactics. She had hunted high-rank beasts to force this meeting, and was now firmly presenting her demands. Diz argued that they simply wanted requests appropriate to their true abilities. Gallop was left speechless for a moment before finally declaring them both C-rank effective immediately, warning them not to go overboard anymore. Outside the office, Royal and Diz shared a silent thumbs up. Later, while Royal sat alone enjoying a cup of tea, he reflected on the sudden rank up. He was genuinely excited about the prospect of a C-rank dungeon. Diz and Sandy had already headed out to gather supplies, and he hoped for their quick return. His solitude was interrupted by a beautiful woman who approached and asked if he was Royal. He felt a flash of his old social anxiety, but he forced himself to stay calm, answering politely. The woman introduced herself as Basori and asked for a moment of his time. Before he could react, she leaned in and grasped his hand, thanking him for falling for her approach so easily. Suddenly, Royal's surroundings dissolved into pitch black. He looked around in shock, realizing he had been teleported to a void of infinite obscurity. Basori watched him, asking if he was too stunned to speak. She revealed that they were in the Black Horizon, a realm of fathomless depth, and identified herself as an executive of Black Steel, a shadow organization serving the Verdun Ducal House. Her eyes turned cold as she declared that Royal would not be leaving that place alive. Chapters end at 17. Thank you for watching, guys. I hope you loved this manga. Have a good day.